Well, it's finally that time, guys. It's time to look back on that Foxconn leak. Now, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, a while ago, and by a while I mean like a month and a half ago or so, maybe 2 months, a Foxconn employee, essentially, somebody in China who's working in the factory, put a leak out about the Switch. They were actually employed and part of the factories that were building and manufacturing, getting the Switches basically ready for launch day, and they put out a whole slew of stuff about what they see when they're at the factory on a daily basis, mostly about the Switch, of course, showing things like battery size, processors, specs, all this stuff. And they put all this out there on the internet, and of course, we all have to take it obviously as, maybe that's pretty cool, but it might not be true. Well, information's come out from Nintendo themselves that is essentially corroborating this report. So we're going to take a look at it. I'll show you what was like dead on right with this report and what it could mean for the Switch going forward. So the first thing that they pretty much got dead on, if you check out, like I said, there's a link in the description now. If you want to go check it out, you can kind of follow along with me. I'll put pictures up here as well as we go. But the first thing they get right is the Nintendo Switch dock. Now, what they describe the dock as is basically no advanced technology inside of it, so it's not like it's not going to boost performance, which we find that out. The only thing it'll do is provide a pass-through for power so the battery can be eliminated from the equation, which would let the clock speeds ramp up to support a higher resolution on the TV. That's all good, that's fine. We pretty much all expected that after hearing that from other sources. But they go on to accurately describe the inputs around the dock, including pretty much the positioning, where they say that 2 of the USB 2s are on the side, and they even managed to describe the ports that are covered by the flap on the back. And of course on the back we have 1 USB 3, 1 HDMI, and they report that pretty much straight up. They even say there's no fan in the dock. We found out recently that there is no fan in the dock. So far this leak is actually pretty legitimate, but it gets even crazier after this. So the one thing I want to point out about this leak from whoever put this out, like I said, someone over in China, it sounds like they start mixing speculation in as to what they see because they don't have an exact processor type or an exact resolution in front of them, because right away they say that looking at the screen, it looks like it's a 1080p screen, multi-touch in particular, which it probably is multi-touch at this point. It's capacitive, so I'm sure it is multi-touch. And it's okay, so this person basically looks at it, and I'm going to tell you, on a 6.2 inch screen, not easy to tell between 720 and 1080. They probably were looking at it, realized it's doing 1080 output to the TV. Maybe it's 1080 on the screen as well, but it does seem that they speculated that. It does not seem that they had any type of resolution in front of them, and I can kind of understand that. It's probably not going to be something that's printed on it or even on the screen at the time. But let's jump past that. We do go to where they talk about the frequencies of the CPU and the GPU. I touched on this before as well, where it's 1,785 megahertz on the CPU and the GPU is 921 megahertz, and the EMC, which is probably the memory clock speed at that point, 1600 megahertz. That all that sets up fine. I was talking about before how that's actually pretty strong, and it still would be. If this is the case, this is still a pretty strong clock speed for a Pascal chip. But again, let's move on past that very quickly. I want to point out some of the other stuff that they had dead on right. And real quick, before we get into that, I noticed that they did say a 4G version is confirmed. While it's still possible that it's out there somewhere, I don't think that's correct. Maybe they looked at 4 gigs. I'm just trying to figure out where they would have got that from. Maybe they looked at 4 gigs of RAM or something, or it could have been, a lot of people are saying maybe it was a translation error. I don't think a 4G version is coming. We would have had that. We would have at least heard of that already. But again, I'm just going to kind of put that to the side for now, and we'll talk about some of the other stuff they got right. So I noticed in this leak, when I first looked at it, that they labeled the battery like all the way down to like 10 milliamp hours, which is insane to get that specific with a battery. But the crazy thing is, it's exactly right. They said it's a 4,310 milliamp hour battery. If you go to Nintendo Japan's site, it says a 4,310 milliamp hour battery. There's actually a really good page over on, I think it's Polygon. I'll put that in the description too, where they translate everything for us, because otherwise you have to translate everything through Google Translate or another site. They translated all of it and gave us the numbers. Yes, the battery in the Switch is a 4,310 milliamp hour battery. So this site was exactly right. We also dropped down from there. They actually give us the weight. And I think a lot of us, when we saw this weight, we were like, no, that can't be it. 300 grams. They put 300 grams of weight down there. And wouldn't you know it? Again, it says about 300 grams of weight. Maybe they're thinking it might change slightly by a gram or two. Of course, margin of error. Anyway, over on Polygon, they talk about the weight. And the weight is actually dead on scary. So here we go. The weight reported by Nintendo of Japan to Polygon. Again, they translated all this from the site. If you go to Nintendo Japan's site, you go to the Switch, you go to tech specs, you can see a lot of the stuff already there. And the weight that they give them is 10.48 ounces. 10.48 ounces, of course, is 297 grams. That's very close. So they do say about 300 grams. They're off by about less than 3 grams, which is, again, a margin of error for a digital scale sometimes, just to be completely honest, because 3 grams is not a lot at all. And it gets more interesting when they go into details about the Joy-Con. Of course, they talked about how it's very, very intricate inside. And all the stuff we've seen with HD rumble, accelerometers, gyroscopes, a decent-sized battery that makes it last 20 hours, IR pointers, buttons all over the thing. That makes a lot of sense now that we hear that. Because before, I think we were all like, oh, it's very intricate inside, maybe it's got an IR pointer or something, but the HD rumble, all this other stuff in there is pretty insane. The buttons on the top were also, from what I can tell, first mentioned here as SL and SR, so this leak also pointed those buttons out completely. Check this thing out, though. They tell us the battery that's in the Joy-Con, 525 milliamp hours. That's what's on Nintendo's site right now, 525 milliamp hours. So they've had the battery for the Switch exactly right. The batteries for the Joy-Con exactly right. And guess what? The weight of the Joy-Con, 50 grams is what's labeled here. Guess how much it is in Nintendo's site? Pretty much 50 grams. So one is heavier than the other, of course, because we do know one can check in amiibos essentially, so it has that technology in there. But what Nintendo has told us, they're basically 50 grams. So we have 2 different weights because, of course, one is heavier than the other because one can check in amiibos. I'm sure there's different things in that one as opposed to the other one. So it says here on Polygon site that one is a bit heavier, so the right is a bit heavier than the left one. 1.84 ounces on the right, 1.73 ounces on the left. 50 grams converts to 1.76 ounces. Again, give or take a few ounces, they are just about dead on with their Joy-Con weight as well. So far, this leak is extremely accurate. Not only do they guess the weights, the sizes, batteries, pretty much everything, they also talk about how they see a red and blue Joy-Con. Well, in this case, they say an orange and blue Joy-Con, but honestly, if it's neon red or neon orange, that's going to look kind of similar to you, especially if maybe you're slightly colorblind at times. But here's the thing. They get that right. There's an orange and there's a blue controller. They kind of start to speculate, oh, maybe it's Splatoon. I think any of us, if we saw those Joy-Cons, we'd be like, yeah, it's probably a Splatoon bundle of some kind. So guys, here's where things get really interesting. So the people over on NeoGAF, there's a couple guys over there that are very, very technically inclined. They will dive into chip voltages and power draw and everything. I mean, they really get into it. In fact, they've drawn curves for graphs and stuff for the Switch. They're trying really hard to figure this out. And what they found out is that Eurogamer's clocks would match up for the lower end X1 type clock speeds. However, the clock speeds that are being given to us from this China leak also match up for the much more efficient Pascal chip. So I'm going to give a quick shout out to someone on the NeoGAF forum that has put in a lot of time and effort to figure a lot of this out. Their name is Zombie. You can check them out over on NeoGAF. I'll leave a link in the description down below for you guys so you can check out this forum that I'm talking about, especially this post. And what they've done is they have essentially figured out that the clock speeds that we see for that Pascal chip on that China site and the clock speeds we see in Eurogamer, they would use the same amount of power. And of course, a lot of us know at this point, just because of all the talk, if you've gathered anything from the talks that you've seen, it's that Pascal is more efficient than Maxwell, the X1. And I think that's what we've all gathered at this point. That's why we all believe it's Pascal, because it would have a better battery draw, especially when being used heavily than Maxwell. So here's the chart. It's a power curve for the NVIDIA Pascal. This is kind of estimated because honestly, guys, we still don't have a Pascal consumer-based chip for the Tegra. But this is actually a rough estimate from another person on the NeoGAF who is very, very smart, Thractor's chart, and you're going to see his chart here. It actually shows like a curve going up, and that just basically is affecting where as you get higher in frequency, especially clock speed, you will start to use more power because you need more energy. That's how it's always worked. That's why things get super hot when you're doing things like video rendering and stuff, because you're generating more heat by pulling more energy, which is effectively raising your clock speed. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the conclusion that Zombie has come to. I actually agree with it heavily because it all makes sense. The math checks out. But again, I'm just going to go over this very quickly with you guys here. So what he is saying is that if you take the clock speeds from, for example, Eurogamer, and use the X1 chip as an example, you would get about 2.23 watts for the system on a chip with Eurogamer's clocks using the X1. Now, if you then switch over to the Pascal chip, based on the charts and the estimates of power draw, based on the other Pascal chips that we know of, and the general 30 or 35% gain of power or 55% gain in efficiency, we can actually get the math to work out the exact same way to 2.23 watts using the A72 processor, using a Pascal chip. We don't even know what that's called yet. It's either an X2 or a P1. The P1 makes more sense because obviously it's Pascal for P1. But anyway, everything makes sense. Everything lines up with a 1.78 gigahertz clock on the A72, and it would then be 921 megahertz on the Tegra P1 chip. The conclusion a lot of people are coming to, especially on this forum, is that the clocks that they were given, because they are probably still using X1 chips to build these games, because that's just what was available. I already showed you guys what the dev kit probably was, the Jetson TX1, and if that's the case, these games, especially for the Switch going forward, are going to become better. By better, I mean graphically. The gameplay obviously will still play very similar, but it's really weird to think that most of us, even probably developers, don't know what chip is in this Switch, and it's the weirdest thing to think about. But what would this tell us going forward using the specs that would be a part of this Reddit post that you see here that have the leaked specs? Because the original post is gone, guys. The original post that was translated from that Chinese site is gone. It's been taken down. And that should tell you something too, to be honest, because there's a chance that Nintendo got wind of that factory worker. Hopefully they were anonymous, was putting out specs. They had to get them off of there, take the post down. And you know what? It's interesting that they don't want to tell people about these specs, especially if this is true. I have a feeling, honestly, that post was probably only taken down because they do start talking about a dev kit version, which is very powerful, that Nintendo probably doesn't want out there right now. But if these are the actual specs, Nintendo should be touting this all over the place. I mean, these are good specs. Anyway, what this could mean for us, let's say it's true. It's using that newer CPU. It's using the Pascal chip. Let's say all of that is correct, okay? This would tell me that games that are first coming out at launch are not going to look anywhere near as good as games that are 2 or 3 years down the road. I know that's very truthful for a lot of systems. You know, you look back at Call of Duty 2 when that first came out on the 360, and then you look at Black Ops 2, and they look so far apart sometimes when you see that game in motion that it's hard to believe it's on the same system. I think the Switch will have that same effect going forward. Do I think, even with these specs, it's on the same plane as the Xbox One? Possibly. I don't think it's going to be around the Xbox One still in terms of raw power, because keep in mind, the wattage I just told you about, this system is running on, I have to estimate here because I don't know the exact power draw, but based on the actual chip possibly running anywhere from 2 to 4 watts, depending on what you're doing, is insane. I mean, more than likely when the system is running on battery, it's probably like 4 to 5 watts. When it's running in the dock, it could be closer to 10, depending on, obviously, how much power draw is happening, how hard it's pushing it. But to consider that, and then consider the Xbox One S is running on 75 watts of power, if that's a technical marvel. I know people like to just rag on the Switch for being weak, but for the amount of power that it draws, it's actually incredibly powerful if you consider that. I mean, it's going to be running games like Xenoverse 2, Xenoblade 2, Breath of the Wild, and it's pulling significantly less power than the other systems. But unfortunately, we still don't know the exact chip that's in the Switch. We probably won't know until we get the thing, take it apart, take x-ray shots. Maybe I'll get lucky, and when I take mine apart, there will be some kind of branding on the chip, like maybe it says X2 or P1 on it. More than likely, there will be some sort of code that I can look up or put on a forum and ask people about, and we can try to figure this thing out together. I really don't want to have to delid my chip, because if there is a heat spreader on it and I damage the chip delidding it, that thing is done. I mean, I'll have $80 Joy-Cons and a $9 dock, so that's not all bad, but then my system won't work. And it's interesting in this case that we could be looking at a very powerful system. However, guys, like I said, the developers have to catch up to it, the consumers have to buy it, or we may not see the extent of the power of the Switch. I think it's very telling when one of the heads of Nintendo comes out and says Breath of the Wild is not using the full potential of the Switch. I think he's absolutely right. I think there's a lot left in the tank for the system going forward, especially if developers were designing games based around what the X1 could push out and not the P1 or the X2. But again, guys, this is all still rumor, still speculation. Man, does this leak line up. I think it's very hard to sit here and say this leak doesn't hold any type of water, because obviously it does. When you guess that battery, man, down to 10, I would have never thought 4310. I would have thought like 4200, 4800. 4,310 is so specific, you have to see it. And people have said on forums, oh, maybe it was on the back of the system. I've seen high definition shots of the back of the system. I couldn't find the battery being printed anywhere. Nothing. I assumed maybe the voltage amperage was printed on the back. I've seen nothing about battery on the back of this system. But yes, guys, take it with what you will. Like I said, in 6 weeks time, we're so close. 6 weeks time, we'll have the system. I will have it in front of me. It will be on this table. Screwdrivers and screws will be flying all over the place, and that thing will be apart, and I'll take pictures, and you guys will see exactly what is at the heart of this system, and it's going to be a long 6 weeks. I don't think they'll let me take my screwdriver in on February 12th when I hopefully can get to the DC event. Yes, guys, check out the leak, though, again, if you haven't seen it. I'll leave that post down below for the NeoGAF forum as well, so you can check that out, too. And I'll see you guys tomorrow morning for Newswave.